The year was 1545, and Spain was the most powerful nation on earth. Its silver flowed from the mines of Peru and Bolivia in quantities that made other monarchs weep into their goblets. Its soldiers had not lost a significant battle in living memory. Its king, Charles V, ruled an empire so vast that the sun genuinely never set on it. Not a boast, but a geographical fact. Into this world of absolute power, boundless wealth, and terrifying expectation, a child was born who would inherit everything and survive almost nothing. Don Carlos arrived on July 8, 1545 in Valladolid, born to Philip, heir to Spain, and Maria Manuela of Portugal. The birth killed his mother 4 days later. She was 16 years old. The boy was premature and jaundiced, tiny and struggling from his first breath, and the court physicians were not optimistic. They were wrong, in the narrow sense. He lived, but the particular way he lived, and the particular things that living cost him, would eventually make survival feel indistinguishable from slow destruction. From the beginning, Don Carlos was the product of centuries of careful dynastic inbreeding that the Habsburgs had elevated to a kind of religious practice. His parents were first cousins. His grandparents on both sides shared blood in configurations that would have alarmed anyone paying attention. His grandmother, Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, had spent the final 46 years of her life locked in a tower at Tordesillas, screaming at the walls and refusing to eat, and speaking to the corpse of her dead husband as though he were still present in the room. The Habsburg jaw, that absurd protruding chin that made the entire dynasty look perpetually confused, was merely the most visible symptom of something that ran far deeper. Don Carlos inherited the jaw. He inherited other things too. His childhood was not cruel in any deliberate sense. There were tutors, servants, horses, dogs, the formal ceremonial affection of Spanish court life. His father Philip, who became Philip II of Spain upon his own father's abdication in 1556, was not a man given to warmth. He was meticulous, devout, cautious, and cold in the particular way that absolute power makes men cold when they have been raised to exercise it without question. But he was not indifferent to his son. Philip wanted Carlos to become what he himself was: disciplined, controlled, effective. What he got instead was something he could not comprehend, and eventually could not tolerate. Don Carlos grew into a young man of startling contradictions and alarming extremes. He was small, with one shoulder visibly higher than the other, his Habsburg jaw pronounced even by Habsburg standards. He had a stammer that worsened under stress, and a tendency toward rages that observers described as genuinely frightening, not merely angry but unhinged. The kind of fury that bypassed rational thought entirely, and expressed itself in violence that surprised even him afterward. He would beat servants for minor infractions. He once ordered the boots of a cobbler who had made him an uncomfortable pair of shoes to be cut up and forced the man to eat them. He threw a page from a window for reasons no one could afterward clearly articulate. He was not consistent in his cruelty. There were also accounts of generosity, of laughter, of genuine charm in his better moments, but the cruelty was volcanic and unpredictable, and that made it worse than if it had been systematic. His health was perpetually fragile. He suffered from fevers that came and went with no discernible cause. He had difficulty eating and was reportedly nearly anorexic at certain periods of his adolescence, subsisting on quantities of food that alarmed his physicians, then swinging into episodes of almost frantic consumption. He slept badly. He had what contemporaries described as fits, though whether these were epileptic seizures or something else is impossible to say with certainty from this distance. His emotional regulation was non-existent. He wept easily and raged easily, and loved with an intensity that made everyone around him uncomfortable, because nothing about his inner life seemed mediated by anything. At 17, he fell down a staircase in Alcalá de Henares while chasing a servant girl. Accounts differ on whether he was pursuing her with amorous intent or simply running. But the effect was the same regardless. He struck his head severely on a locked door at the bottom of the stairs and lay unconscious for days. The wound became infected. His skull swelled to alarming proportions. The court physicians tried everything in their considerable arsenal, which is to say they tried everything wrong: bleeding, poultices, the application of the recently deceased body of a Franciscan friar laid directly against the prince's head as a holy relic, which tells you a great deal about the state of 16th-century medicine. He was not expected to survive. He did survive, but the accident left marks. His behavior, already erratic, became more so. His rages intensified. His sleep became more disrupted. Whether the fall itself caused neurological damage or whether it merely accelerated tendencies that were already present from birth, tendencies encoded in the double helix of his extraordinary genealogy, is a question that historians have been arguing about for 4 centuries without resolution. What is clear is that after Alcalá, Don Carlos was a different and more dangerous version of himself. He was also, now, the heir apparent to the most powerful throne in the world. Philip II watched his son with the expression of a man who has ordered an important structural component and received something entirely unsuitable. This was not merely personal disappointment, though it was certainly that. It was a political problem of the first order. Spain in the 1560s was managing an empire under enormous stress. The Protestant Reformation was tearing Northern Europe apart. The Dutch provinces, the Spanish Netherlands, were beginning to express the first tremors of what would become the 80 Years' War, the long grinding conflict by which they would eventually prize themselves free of Spanish control. Philip needed competent men around him, men he could trust with sensitive responsibilities, men who could govern. Don Carlos was none of these things. The prince's education had been thorough and largely wasted. He had been taught Latin, history, philosophy, the military arts. He retained some of it and showed occasional flashes of genuine intelligence. He read widely, had opinions about literature, could hold a conversation about theology. But the retention was inconsistent, and the application almost entirely absent. He had no patience for administration, no interest in the grinding daily work of governance that occupied his father for 12 to 14 hours a day. He was impulsive where Philip was deliberate, public where Philip was secretive, loud where Philip was quiet. They were, in almost every measurable way, incompatible human beings who happened to be father and son. What made the situation genuinely dangerous rather than merely sad was Don Carlos's politics. By the early 1560s, he had developed a passionate obsession with the Netherlands. This was, in some ways, understandable. The Netherlands was in theory his inheritance, the region his father had ruled before becoming King of Spain, the rich commercial heart of Northern Europe. Carlos wanted to go there. He wanted to govern, or at least to be seen governing, to have some function beyond the purely ceremonial existence of a Spanish crown prince, which consisted mainly of attending masses and sitting through interminable court functions. He petitioned his father repeatedly, and was repeatedly denied. Philip's reasons for the refusal were not difficult to fathom. The Netherlands in the late 1550s and into the 1560s was becoming a powder keg. The Calvinist faith was spreading rapidly through the merchant classes of the northern provinces. Local nobles were beginning to organize against the heavy taxation and religious persecution that Spanish rule entailed. Sending Don Carlos into that environment, volatile, impressionable, prone to being manipulated, capable of making catastrophic decisions in a fit of pique, would have been like sending a lit torch into a room full of gunpowder. Philip saw this clearly. Carlos saw only the refusal. The prince began developing relationships with men his father distrusted. Most significant among these was William of Orange, William the Silent, as he would later be known, who was at this point still nominally a loyal servant of the Spanish crown, but already maneuvering toward the independence that would define his legacy. Whether the relationship between Carlos and William was genuinely conspiratorial, or whether it was simply the natural friendship between a frustrated prince and an ambitious noble who happened to share an interest in the Netherlands, is debated. What is not debated is that Philip found out about it, and found out about it in the worst possible way, through his network of informants, which meant he had been watching his son be indiscreet for some time before he acted. In 1567, Philip sent the Duke of Alba to the Netherlands with an army of 10,000 men and a mandate to suppress the growing revolt with maximum force. Alba was not a subtle instrument. He was brilliant, ruthless, and entirely devoid of the political instincts that might have told him there are situations where maximum force produces maximum resistance. His arrival in the Netherlands inaugurated a reign of terror that would eventually, paradoxically, guarantee the Dutch independence he had been sent to prevent. Don Carlos was furious. He had wanted to go to the Netherlands himself. Instead, his father had sent a general and an army, effectively announcing to the world that the heir to the Spanish throne was not trusted with any meaningful responsibility. Carlos decided to do something about this. The problem was that he was entirely unsuited to the kind of careful, patient conspiracy that might have actually achieved results. He talked too much. He confided in too many people. He told his uncle Don John of Austria, Philip's illegitimate half-brother, the future hero of Lepanto, that he intended to kill the Duke of Alba, which is not the kind of information you share with a man whose primary loyalty is to the king. He solicited money from various nobles to fund what he vaguely described as a journey whose purpose kept shifting in his accounts. Sometimes it was the Netherlands, sometimes it was Germany, sometimes it was simply away. He was not building a conspiracy. He was performing one, broadcasting it to anyone who would listen, as though the act of talking about escape was itself a kind of escape. Don John told Philip in November 1567. He told him, by the account of those present, with reluctance and evident distress, in a private audience that lasted several hours. What Philip said in response has not survived. What he did in response did. On the night of January 18, 1568, Philip II of Spain entered his son's chambers at the Alcazar of Madrid, accompanied by a small group of privy councillors and personal guards. It was after midnight. Don Carlos was woken from sleep. Philip personally removed the weapons from his son's room. The prince kept a loaded arquebus near his bed and told Carlos that he was under arrest. The prince, by accounts gathered afterward from the men present, was initially confused, then terrified, then desperate. He threw himself at his father's feet and begged, pleading to know what he had done, pleading not to be sent to his death, asking if he was going to be executed. Philip, whose face throughout the entire proceeding was described as calm to the point of inhumanity, told his son that he was not going to die. He was to be confined. The windows of Don Carlos's rooms were sealed with iron bars. His books were taken away. Some of them, anyway, accounts differ on this detail. His servants were replaced with guards. He was cut off from virtually all communication with the outside world. No one was told officially why the heir to the Spanish throne had been imprisoned by his father. The silence was both political and personal. The silence of a man who found the entire situation too shameful to discuss, too complex to explain, and too dangerous to leave uncontrolled. Carlos, trapped, returned to the extremes that had always defined him. He refused to eat for extended periods, then ate compulsively. He demanded heat in his rooms in the middle of summer and cold in the middle of winter, insisting on sleeping on ice and flooding the floor with cold water in the July heat of Madrid. He starved himself to weakness, then consumed astonishing quantities of food in a single sitting, 6 partridges, reportedly, at one meal, along with other dishes, consumed with the desperate urgency of a man eating against time. His behavior in confinement was that of someone whose relationship to his own body had become a last remaining theater of autonomy. He could not govern. He could not travel. He could not speak freely or see who he wished to see. But he could refuse food or eat until he was sick, and no one could make him stop. He drank large quantities of cold water and snow, which his physicians warned him against repeatedly and which he continued doing regardless. By the spring of 1568, he was visibly declining. The fevers returned. He became increasingly weak. He could no longer hold conversations at any length. He asked, in one of the more heartbreaking details to survive in the historical record, to speak with his father. Philip did not come. There is a letter. It was written by Don Carlos from his confinement and addressed to his father. In it, the prince asked to be treated as a son rather than a prisoner, asked to be given some freedom, asked his father to come and see him. The letter is not the work of a political schemer or a dangerous conspirator. It is the letter of a young man, 23 years old, who does not understand what has happened to him, or why his father has stopped loving him, or whether his father ever loved him at all, and who is trying to express this in terms that will not make things worse. Philip received the letter. He did not respond to it. He did not visit. Don Carlos died on July 24th, 1568, 6 months and 6 days after his arrest. He was 23 years old. The official cause was given as fever and the various physical consequences of his behavior in confinement. The starvation, the excess, the cold water, the abuse of a body that had always been fragile. The Venetian ambassador, who was one of the more reliable observers at the Spanish court, wrote that the prince had simply died of the general deterioration of his constitution. Other observers were less charitable toward Philip. Rumors spread across Europe almost immediately. He had been poisoned, he had been strangled, he had been forced to drink poison, and offered the choice between that and being publicly executed. A story that circulated widely and was almost certainly false but proved remarkably durable, appearing in one form or another across 2 centuries of commentary, and eventually inspiring a Schiller play and a Verdi opera that would make Don Carlos famous for reasons entirely unconnected to anything that actually happened. Philip II's behavior throughout the imprisonment and after his son's death was precisely what you would expect from a man who had been forced by circumstances into a decision he could neither defend publicly nor acknowledge privately. He wrote to various European courts, explaining that his son had died of illness. He wore mourning clothes. He attended the funeral. He ordered the body interred at El Escorial, the vast monastery palace he was then constructing outside Madrid, which would eventually serve as the mausoleum for the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. Whether he grieved is impossible to say. He was not a man who showed his interior life to anyone, and his interior life, by all accounts, was genuinely difficult to locate even for those who spent years in his company. What we can say is that Philip never spoke publicly about why he imprisoned his son, and never offered any formal explanation. The closest he came was a letter to Pope Pius V, written shortly after the arrest, in which he said that he had been forced to act against his own blood for the service of God and the welfare of his kingdoms, and that this had cost him more than anyone could know. Whether this was genuine anguish or political positioning, or both at once, as is usually the case with powerful men explaining their worst decisions, there is no way to determine. Philip was a man whose piety was absolutely sincere, and whose political calculations were absolutely relentless. And he saw no contradiction between the two, because he genuinely believed he was doing God's work. The historical debate about what actually happened, about what Don Carlos did or intended to do, about what Philip actually knew and feared, has never been satisfactorily resolved, and probably never will be. The sources are partial, often second-hand, frequently written by people with strong interests in particular versions of events. The Venetian ambassadors are the most reliable observers, and their accounts are detailed, but incomplete. Spanish court records from the relevant period were carefully managed, which is to say, carefully controlled. Philip was a man who understood information as power, and exercised that understanding consistently throughout his reign. What seems most likely, on the available evidence, is this. Don Carlos was not the tragic romantic hero of Schiller's imagination, not the enlightened liberal prince crushed by his tyrannical father for his sympathy with Dutch Protestantism, not the victim of pure political calculation. That version was invented in the 18th and 19th centuries by writers who needed a usable symbol and found one in the gaps of the historical record. The real Don Carlos was more complicated and more sympathetic in a different way. A young man with genuine neurological problems, the product of an inheritance he had no ability to understand or manage, placed in a position that required qualities he did not possess, and surrounded by men who needed him to succeed and watched him failing with increasing alarm. Nor was Philip the monster of the opera, cold and calculating and motivated primarily by a desire to eliminate a rival. He was a man who had watched his son for 23 years, with a combination of hope, disappointment, anxiety, and love. Love of the particular suppressed Habsburg kind, which expressed itself mostly through management rather than affection. He waited a very long time before he acted. He tried, within his limited emotional vocabulary, to find some other solution. When he finally acted, he acted decisively and without cruelty, in the sense of deliberate sadism, though what he did was devastating in its effects. He imprisoned a sick and unstable young man in a sealed room and waited for the problem to resolve itself, and the problem resolved itself in the only way it could. There is something in this story that exceeds its particular historical moment and reaches something more universal. It is a story about what happens when the requirements of a role exceed the capacities of the person placed in it, about the particular cruelty of high expectation visited on someone constitutionally unable to meet it. Don Carlos did not ask to be heir to Spain. He did not choose the genealogy that made him what he was. The centuries of careful cousin marriage that compounded recessive traits into something unmanageable. The grandmother who screamed at the corpse of her dead husband in a tower in Tordesillas. He was handed a destiny he could not carry, and then condemned for dropping it. It is also a story about the intersection of power and paternal love, about what happens to love when it is required to submit to political necessity. Philip II was in many ways a devoted father, devoted in the sense that he spent enormous energy trying to manage his son's situation, thinking about what could be done, arranging tutors and advisors and opportunities. What he could not do was simply love Carlos without agenda, without the constant anxious assessment of whether the prince was becoming what he needed to be. The affection was always conditional on the performance, and the performance was always inadequate. The letter Don Carlos wrote from his prison room, asking his father to come and see him, to treat him as a son, is the distillation of this tragedy. He did not ask to be released. He did not bargain or threaten or make political arguments. He asked for his father. Philip, who was capable of spending 10 hours a day on correspondence about the governance of Flanders, did not find time to walk across the palace and sit with his dying son. After Carlos died, Philip went on to rule Spain for another 30 years with remarkable effectiveness. He oversaw the Battle of Lepanto, the greatest naval victory of the 16th century. He annexed Portugal and added it to the Spanish crown. He managed, with great competence and enormous effort, one of the most complex governing operations in human history. He also watched the Dutch revolt slowly, inexorably succeed despite everything he threw at it, and saw the Spanish Armada destroyed by English weather and English cannon in 1588, and died in 1598 in the monastery he had built at El Escorial, worn out and ridden with gout, and reportedly at peace. He was 69 years old. His son had been dead for 30 years. Don Carlos left almost nothing behind. No children, no works, no letters that survive in any quantity. What he left was a story, or rather several stories. The romantic story that Schiller made from him, the historical story that scholars have been arguing about ever since, and the human story underneath both of them. A boy born too soon to a mother who died for him, shaped by forces he couldn't see and couldn't resist, placed at the center of the most powerful court in the world, and unable to function in it, ending his days, sealed in a room in his father's palace, alone, asking to see a man who would not come. The Habsburgs would continue their dynasty for another 150 years in Spain, the inbreeding continuing, the jaw continuing, the accumulated consequences of the genealogy continuing. Carlos II, the last Spanish Habsburg, born in 1661, was so profoundly disabled by the same processes that had made Don Carlos unstable that he could barely speak or walk or eat without assistance. He was called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because his own subjects could find no natural explanation for what had been done to him by nature and by the deliberate choices of his ancestors. He died without heirs in 1700, and his death ended the dynasty in Spain and triggered a war that would reshape Europe. Don Carlos was not the last cost of the Spanish Habsburg project, but he was perhaps the most visible one, the one who could not be hidden or managed or explained away, the one whose imprisonment in his father's palace was too stark and strange to be forgotten. He has been remembered in ways he would not recognize, as a hero, as a symbol, as a tenor's role in an opera that bears his name but tells almost none of his actual story. The real story is sadder and stranger and more instructive than any of these versions. It is the story of a human being crushed between what was demanded of him and what he was capable of giving, between the love he needed and the calculations that took its place. It is the story of a man who never had a chance, and who spent his short life unable to understand why.